Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Adult Sunday School lesson for July the 19th, 2026. It's an Old Testament lesson from the book of Numbers entitled Rebellion. This month, we're looking at key chapters in the book of Numbers, which is our study for the entire month. We've looked at Moses appointing 12 leaders or deputies to help him manage the wandering people. Last week we saw how Moses sends out 12 spies to reconnoiter the promised land of Canaan. And today we see the rebellion due to lack of water in the wilderness. Next week we will end our study in Numbers with an interesting lesson regarding King Balak of Moab. But these lessons show us how to cope with hard times. They show us how to live with hope and confidence amid struggle. In ancient times, such as Moses was experiencing back in the narratives described in the book of Numbers, as of today, we see God's power over life's obstacles. The first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes referred to as the Law of Moses, is also called the Pentateuch. And during the month of July, we have a series of lessons from the 4th book of the Bible that's called in English Numbers. The main point, a little bit of background information about the book of Numbers, is we see God's people bound for the promised land, problems and all. We see in the book of Numbers that Moses orders a census. Actually, he does so twice, but the purpose of the census is to obtain a numbering of all the men who are old enough to fight in battle, because they know they're going to have some struggles along the way. The Jewish name in the Hebrew scriptures for the book of Numbers is translated in the wilderness, which is a better description. At least it talks about where they are and what they're doing rather than just the book of Numbers. This book contains narratives of struggle and rebellion, particularly against Moses and against God. But for Christians, one of the main teaching points we get from the book of Numbers is we can read it as condemnation of God's people in any age who refuse to go forward by faith. So there are lots of instructions for us in the book of Numbers. Dr. Francisco, longtime seminary professor, says there is so much of a numerical nature in this book, such as 12 spies, 40 days, 10 years, lots of details. It's much like the book of Leviticus in that regard. The people travel to Kadesh Barnea, then they wander aimlessly for 40 years, finally returning to the very same spot. On their way to Jericho, they run out of water and rebel under a false leader named Korah. In a face down between Moses and Korah, God sends an earthquake that swallows up Korah, thereby indicating that Moses is the correct leader of the people, even though there's division and lots of grumbling. Moses is still in charge. But throughout this book, we see a lot of quarreling, rumbling, and rebellion by this rabble people that they want freedom, they want comfort, but they have hard times that they have to get over in order to attain the comfort that they seek. They want the good, but are reluctant to put in the effort needed to overcome their struggles. Today, we see the result of disbelief or failure to follow God's instructions. It's a complex story with many subplots that we could go into in a lot of detail, but I'm going to hit only the main story and the main points. Some of these subplots entail lack of water, the rebellion, there's disobedience of Moses and Aaron, and even the need for a new leader to take over. But the narrative, much of the narrative that we see in our text today is similar to events narrated in Exodus chapter 17, where Moses obtains water by striking a rock. We'll see him do the same thing today in Numbers chapter 20. But in today's text, Moses is instructed to speak to the rock. His disobedience in striking the rock is seen by God as worthy of severe punishment. And this has caused commentators, biblical writers, and those who are studying this in some detail to wonder what evil Moses could have done to spark the wrath or anger of God. He seems to be obeying the instructions, but yet he isn't really. We can remind ourselves of the geographical situation here, and that over on the left would be Egypt, from which the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, has escaped, and they've come to rest in an oasis in the desert called Kadesh Barnea. That's where they were last week. Today we see that they have marched and they're on the road to Jericho. Eventually they will go into the promised land, but on the journey from Kadesh Barnea up to the promised land of Canaan, they run out of water. Here we have a happy situation described in Exodus 17, where they're out in the desert. There's no river, but water is miraculously provided by God through Moses, who uses his rod. That's the same rod that Moses used to color the Nile, to call down pestilence, to divide the Red Sea. It has some of God's power in it, no doubt. Moses taps or strikes the rock and outpours water that the people need in order to live. But in Numbers 20, the situation results in a different outcome. So let's read this scripture. Again, I urge you to turn on the closed caption feature of YouTube in order to see the words as I pronounce them. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble all the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Thus you shall bring water out of the rock for them. Thus you shall provide drink for the congregation and their livestock." So Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock as he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his head and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and through which he showed himself to be holy." Wow. This lack of water causes rebellion against Moses and Aaron, which is a continuing narrative, continuing story in these first books of the Bible. So Moses and Aaron retreat to the sanctuary, tent of meeting as it's called, where the glory of Yahweh, in this scripture, when I said the word Lord, the base text included where the great name of God, or Yahweh, appears. It says the glory of Yahweh. We don't know exactly what that was, whether it was a pillar, a cloud, a fire, a voice. It's not specified, but they experienced God there in the tent of meeting, where God appeared to them with instructions for Moses. The instructions include take the staff or the rod, this great rod that Moses had used to assemble all the people together, step 2, and then to command the rock before the people to yield its water. Seems simple enough. 3-step process to get glory, or to get water for the people. Here's an interesting adjunct to this story, that there's a rabbinic tradition or teaching of the rabbis that in order to obtain water, as the children of Israel wandered around in the wilderness, they needed this rock to get water, but the rock traveled with them so that they always had access to water. So this idea of getting water from a rock is obvious enough, but it's less obvious how they were always in contact with the rock. And according to tradition of the rabbis, the rock traveled with them. Very convenient. There's a New Testament reference to this water from the rock, which is interesting, and which I'll point out is in order to provide water continually, as Israel wandered in the desert, I've mentioned that the rabbis taught about this water rock traveling with them. Referring to this tradition, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:4 spiritualizes the image or the metaphor. Rather than a physical rock traveling with Israel, Paul says that the Spirit of Christ traveled with them and sustained them in the wilderness. So we can see a New Testament application to this text in Numbers that we're dealing with today. So Moses performed steps 1 and 2, but instead of speaking to the rock, Moses, the text says, if you read it very carefully, Moses spoke to the people instead of to the rock. Saying, shall we, meaning myself and Aaron, shall we bring forth water out of this rock? He asked the people. So Moses struck the rock twice, perhaps in anger. We don't know. He may have just tapped it, but the implication is that he struck it with anger. Water did come out, but I note that the credit for this activity would go to Moses and Aaron because he didn't speak to the rock, he spoke to the people and indicated that he was bringing forth the water for the people. Poor Moses. I mean, he has endured their rebellion and their complaints, and he may be worn down to the point where he just loses his discipline. But Moses, it seems, did not follow God's instructions in that he did not trust God and he did not show God's holiness to the people. Perhaps had he commanded the rock, the water would have come out and the people would have naturally assumed that God provided that water to them. The way he did it was ambiguous, made it seem that Moses and Aaron were the ones providing the water. Therefore, Moses and Aaron were not allowed to lead the people into Canaan. Seems a harsh punishment for that. But this is the unhappy situation narrated in Numbers 20. In my background preparation for this lesson, some of the commentators that you will read believe that the same situation is being narrated in Numbers 20 that was described back in Exodus 17. But the way it's come down in written form in the Bible that we have, they are presented as separate incidents. And there's enough difference in there to make me think that they're probably two different situations that are being encountered. And it does give reason for why Moses was displaced from leadership and not allowed to conquest the land of Canaan, but the mantle was passed over to Joshua. So this may be one way to explain the change in leadership. That's according to some of the Bible commentators. Here is our study guide writer, Dr. Ballard. He says, how can we overcome our lack of faith, which oftentimes wells up into frustration and anger, when God seems to be distant or absent? I stress that word seem because God is ever present with us and ever concerned. Sometimes in our human understanding, it seems to us God is distant or absent. So how do you deal with this frustration? Do you just hop over to the sanctuary, fall on our faces before God, and wait for the magic answer? No way. God is always there, but we may not always hear God's answer clearly. Perhaps Moses heard an answer, but not God's clear instructions. Sometimes it takes years of waiting to know God's master plan. This is according to Wayne Ballard, our lesson writer for today. But the price to pay for unfaithfulness, this is another key theme in the book of Numbers. For the people, 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, we saw this in last week's session. For Moses and Aaron, they were not allowed to enter the promised land of Canaan. That's today's lesson. Events of Numbers 20 are very similar to those of Exodus 17, for Moses strikes the rock and it yields water. So why is he punished so severely here? Well, the best I can come up with is that the real point of the story is that Moses' time of leadership is past. This is what the Baptist commentator says of these verses, and this is one way to indicate that it's time for Moses to pass the mantle of leadership on to Joshua. So here is an image that I found of Moses sitting atop, I believe this would be Mount Moab, as they're looking at the promised land of Canaan. Moses is allowed to see the promised land, but he's not allowed to enter it, nor was his brother Aaron. Lessons for us today. God's always with us in the midst of our problems, but we sometimes do not clearly understand God's plans for us. Complaint and rebellion do not solve our problems. They add to our problems. It's far more productive to channel that unfocused anger into devotion, action planning, seeking help, and constructive solutions to the problems we encounter. We're not told of Moses' reaction to his punishment, but we are told that he continues to lead the people as best he could until his dying day. So, please join a Sunday school class or other discussion group in order to add your comments and to hear other input. Classes are available here at First Baptist Middletown for every age group. I do thank you for joining me today. I urge you not to take me too seriously. I bring a layperson's understanding to our study, so you need to seek additional input from your pastor or other teacher. This lesson is presented for educational purposes only. That is, no commercial intent whatsoever. Please do remember our prayer concerns, and I'll see you next week as we conclude the month of July in our study of the book of Numbers. I do thank the Reverend Darrell Elster, our seminary-trained minister of education and technology, who produces, directs, troubleshoots, loads these sessions onto YouTube. And according to the YouTube account, there are more than 300 of these sessions now available on YouTube. Thank you, Reverend Elster. Until next week, I will say goodbye.